Today's guest is a legend within the Mass Effect community. Joining Bioware in 2003 as a writer on Jade Empire, he would go on to become a lead writer of both Mass Effect 2 and 3, as well as working on Anthem and being a creative director for Andromeda. In 2013, he was also nominated for a BAFTA award, writing for Mass Effect 3, as well as writing the comic series Mass Effect Redemption. This is all before returning to be project manager for the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. I am, of course, talking about the one and only Mac Walters. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great intro, by the way. Thank you. Very succinct, very clear. Love it.
Now, Mass Effect 2 is my favorite game out of the trilogy, but it was a bit of a leap from Mass Effect 1 to Mass Effect 2. I mean, so how did you balance the gameplay and what kind of, the story versus gameplay, and what kind of challenges did you face?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, secretly, I will tell you, two's my favorite as well. But although interestingly, I have all these different perspectives on it as well. Like one is probably more near and dear to my heart from a development standpoint because just we were creating this new IP. It was everything about the team and bringing it about for the first time that was just so innovative and it just felt like we were kind of on a high wire act the whole time trying to figure out where we were headed, and there was that sort of tension as we were you're creating something, you just don't know if people are going to love it or not. That was exhilarating, but as a final product too is incredible, and I have a lot of fond memories of working on that as well. The transition from 1 to 2, that was really interesting, in the sense that we came up with the concept of the sort of Dirty Dozen, which it was before it became the Dirty 10 plus 2 in DLC. And this sort of idea of the suicide mission, that was actually pretty early in sort of discussions of what we wanted to do with Mass Effect 2. And so just in that, you can see that the story and the plot and narrative are really starting to drive sort of the direction of the product right off the bat. That said, we had no delusions about some of the, let's call it the clunkiness of some of the systems and features in Mass Effect 1. And we knew that we wanted to improve those. And a lot of times it's not as simple as, hey, we're starting a new project. Here's the 10 things we're going to do. A lot of times it's more of an exploration of how do we improve X? How do we improve Y? Right. And then people will sort of run off and try new things. And the great thing with 2 was, and the reason I think that we see such a a bigger leap between 1 and 2 and then that you see between 2 and 3 is that there was a lot of things in 1 that we just never really achieved, and a lot of that was because we're first time on a new engine, first time new team, first time new IP. You're just figuring everything out, right? And so ultimately at the end you have to bring it all together. Now that we had that underneath us, and we understood the engine, our tools were a little bit more robust and mature, and the team certainly knew each other a little bit better. It afforded us that freedom to really explore certain things like we did with the combat, and really sort of pushing that along. And I think ultimately when I look at the combat specifically, we had wanted it to be an action RPG in the truest sense, and there weren't a lot of things we could point to like that, certainly in the shooter space at back in the day. And we intentionally went, and I think it was more near the end of 1 where we started to bring on people on staff who had more experience in the shooter space, and then we really wanted to just let them run with it in 2. And that's why you start to see some of these big evolutions, whether it's with heat sinks and and people think, oh, is that an easy decision? It's like, no, lots of debate on the team, as much debate as there was in the community about switching to heat sinks and things like that. We had those debates internally, but ultimately we would, we want to go where the fun was, right? Yeah. So I mean, an explorative adventure. The interesting thing was, though, with 2 was we ended up, on a much shorter timeline as well, than 1. 1 had taken 4.5 years, and 2 was just over 2 to get done. And so there was a lot of rapid decision making where we kind of found something we liked and went with it and kept going, sort of thing, and didn't look back. And ultimately, obviously, I guess that worked, right? In the end, we got 2. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, I'd love to hear any follow-ups on that.
I would be curious to ask, just as someone who's old enough to remember the original like Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate and
Mm,
Neverwinter Nights and all those other games. Just as much as I love all the games, like there's a pretty big difference. Like from one feels more like a traditional quote unquote RPG,
yep.
whereas two feels more like an action game with RPG elements. Was that something you purposefully chose to like make it more sellable, or I don't know if that's the right word, but I think you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean, and it wasn't really to appeal to a broader audience. I think what we found was we were trying to do two things in Mass Effect One, which was bring in this action element and still be an RPG. And what we discovered was they fight each other a lot, right? And so as we went forward with the franchise, it was clear that we had to sort of double down on certain things if we really wanted to execute on what we imagined, the gameplay to be. And certainly on the gameplay side, we just had to back away from some of those things that are traditionally RPG and focus more on the action and put that first and foremost. And I think that's just it was more of an evolution than an evolution towards let's really improve because Bioware hadn't really done action before that. Everything was either turn based or our old isometric games and things like that. This was us really sort of flexing new muscles for the first time and really learning how to do that. And we decided if we're going to do it, we should really double down on it. And then it was about finding that line where you haven't stripped away so much of the RPG that you feel like you're missing something. And if you're an RPG lover, you probably felt like two was too light on some of those elements. And there's still people to this day. I know when Legendary Edition came out, there's a lot of debate. It's like, no, I love one. That's the only one I love, or it's my favorite because of usually because of a lot of those RPG elements. Um, and it's interesting. The one thing that I would say is, we've had this conversation in hindsight. It's like, what would 2 and 3 had looked like had we gone the other way and said, you know what, maybe we're not good at this action stuff, and let's just turn this into a full-on RPG and go 2 and 3. And it certainly could have ended up that way, right? There was no predestined plan, or something about, oh, you've got to do action to sell more units. They got to say it just was. I think for us, when we were playing the game, what we were enjoying about it, it's like, no, we want more of this. How do we get there?
I think
Okay.
3 has a nice balance, doesn't it, between 1 being heavy RPG
Hmm.
and then it was stripped back for 2, and then you kind of brought them both together for Mass Effect 3.
Yeah, I'd agree with that statement.
First and foremost, I'm gonna out myself as the world's #1 Kai Lang simp, and like I have a tattoo of him. But my question is, I don't know if you had anything to do with the comics or novels or anything, but he's such an interesting and well fleshed out character in the expanded universe. Like,
Hmm.
however you feel about him, he's just legitimately interesting. Was there ever a like talks or discussion to make him more of a focus? Because otherwise, if you only know him from just the third game, he's literally just like what my wife charitably calls anime Keanu Reeves.
Right. Yeah, and I think so I believe someone could fact check me on this, but I believe where he first appeared was in Drew's novel when we were following the exploits. So I think Anderson, we saw Kai Lang in there, and that's we always wanted to, I always find, and we all agreed with this, which was if you're going to do something that's not in the game specifically, it's a tie-in, it's expanded universe, let's try to find ways to incorporate that into the game at some point, right? Like we did that with Farron in Redemption, bringing him into one of the DLCs. And I just find there's much more, we think about it more, it ends up feeling more, to your point, like it feels like a more well-balanced character in that regards, because we can explore more facets with them. And for Kai Lang specifically, I remember there was a lot more of Kai Lang in 3, and I can't remember, truth be told, why those got cut. Probably just for clarity and time and all the rest of it. And when I say a lot more, it wasn't like you could, there was a whole Kai Lang mission, but there was a few more appearances with Kai Lang at some point as we were, fleshing out the story and the main plot, and they kind of got whittled down a little bit. But yeah, I think that's the beauty of that expanded universe. I could totally see where in the future someone could do a whole comic on Kai Lang, right? Why not?
With Kai Lang, was there any? Because I know there's always been talk of because he was like introduced late on in the game. Would there any thought about bringing like a character from Mass Effect 2 from the Cerberus ship, so somebody that you like Jacob for example,
Right.
but rather than making Jacob a good guy in 3, keeping
Right.
him that he stayed with Cerberus, and then you had to like the Kai Lang character, so you had that kind of dynamic between the main character. And was there anything like that ever discussed, or was it not something that was?
I don't think so. I mean, the hard part is with a lot of the characters, of course, you have to remember what happens is we release the characters, especially the ones that are, on the side of the protagonist, right? On the side of Shepard as they're going through. Not everyone loves every character, right? That's why we do them the way we do. We want people to fall in love with some of the characters, but they don't have to fall in love with all. But that said, there's always those who fall in love with a character, right? And if we make major pivots on those characters between games, I think in general, we've kind of tried to be careful with that because, a lot of people really didn't like the fact that, you couldn't really romance, Liara or Ash or Caden, depending on who you chose in 2, but even though that was intentional on our part, we wanted to sort of have this sort of middle act where they were distant and doing their own thing. And then in the third act, if you stayed true, you actually got different sort of relationship options with them if you had stayed true through 2 with Ash and Caden and Liara. But even that sort of limited change, like that's not them switching allegiances and becoming evil or anything. Even that, we saw a lot of people just go, oh, I can't believe you did that. Like how could you change that, right? And people become very invested in the characters, rightfully so, and especially because it's all wrapped up in their Shepard and their story. So yeah, it's about ultimately, whether we had conversations about it, perhaps not specifically that I remember about Jacob, but um, generally that's where the conversation would stop, though. It's just like, yeah, we know the fans of that character are not going to abide by that if we go too far.
Was there ever any talk or discussion in Mass Effect 3 of, because in the Citadel DLC, Rex can come back. Was there ever any talk in the base game of having Jack or Miranda come back as squad mates? Because I'm just saying, it's just, those are two, in my opinion, of the most interesting relationships. But those are the only two relationships that if you stick with in the third game, your Shepard goes to bed alone before Chrono Station.
Right. Yeah. 100%. There was talk of doing that. Ultimately, it became really challenging. So, what a lot of people may not realize is just how big Mass Effect 3 really is under the hood. If you actually look at things like lines of dialogue or the number of assets, which I did recently when we when we were working on Legendary Edition, I believe it's on par with this size wise and just asset wise and things like that of the other 2 games combined, right? There's a ton of stuff in there. It doesn't play like it necessarily if you play it once. It's just a very wide game that has all of these options that, of course, that's on us. We decided to do a suicide mission where everyone could live or die in Mass Effect 2 was a great idea, and we knew that we would pay that price one day, and that price was when we did Mass Effect 3, and that's why it became such a wide game. But then ultimately you're left with all these decisions like, well, it just feels like this is right, but we can't do everything. We can't have everyone a squad mate. We can't, like, especially when we don't know if they're, technically alive or technically dead or anything like that. Like, it's just starting to put all this effort and emphasis on a maybe, right? And ultimately, I think in the sort of full expanded, we had all the time in the world version of Mass Effect 3. It'd be great to bring everyone back in some form, in the way that you remember them from 2. And ultimately, well, the best, I think we did honestly a really good job of bringing folks back and making sure that they felt important with the level of importance they had in the previous games. But yeah, there were always those Sophie's choices that we had to make.
So many choices and so many ifs or buts, or if they're alive, then but they're it must have been such a mammoth task. And obviously the extra dialogue voice, lines that you've got to record, and
Yep.
yeah, it must have been huge to try and bring all those ends together and tie everything together as well as you did.
And also think about them on a regular basis, like just because there's so many threads and so many different ways that things can work out, and have it all make sense no matter which path you take. Like if you look at the number of actual choice points, both coming into the game and the ones you can make in the game, it's it gets up into like the millions of millions, right? Like I think our lead designer at one point actually did the math on it, like how many actual choices are in there and permutations, and some of them are obviously very slight, but it just gets into this like great spaghetti of narrative that's out there. And I don't know that I would, one thing would be great. We don't have this telemetry, but I always thought it'd be great if somebody could just get an AI to play every possible version and see how many there actually are, but also see if they actually all do work. Because I guarantee there are permutations that have just never been played, just
Wow.
to this day.
Oh, I'd believe it. I've done, I think, something like 45 playthroughs, and I still find new things.
Yeah, exactly. So
Do you still play?
yeah, so this is my little I guess dirty secret. I have rarely, if ever, played a game that I've shipped. Mostly because in the build up to ship, you've probably played that game hundreds of times, right? Or permutations of that game or parts of that game hundreds of times. So there's that. You kind of get a bit of fatigue with it. Secondly, as good as the games are, it's really hard to not just see the flaws or the things that we didn't fix or the things that we couldn't do. So it just kind of this constant painful reminder of, you didn't get that done, did you? And it wasn't until Legendary Edition that I actually went back and started replaying. It was my job. I had to go back and, it's like, well, we've got to make some decisions here. And, enough time had passed that it was actually enjoyable to go back and do that again. But even that had limits where I was just like, let's just fix this stuff and get this out the door. I don't want to play it a million more times and be reminded, because even then there were things with the Legendary Edition that we wanted to fix that we knew we weren't going to be able to do. So again, more painful reminders, at least as a developer,
Well, that's completely fair. I remember right in anticipation of the Legendary Edition, I'd done a full playthrough of the original trilogy, and then the Legendary Edition came out, and I started it, and I played for 7 hours, and was like, I literally just did this. Why am I playing it again?
Yeah. But hopefully it was improved.
It was improved. I did enjoy the quality of life improvements in Mass Effect 1.
Yeah. Thank you. The team will appreciate that.
Speaking of how much, especially when it comes to time, like when you're carrying so many characters over to so many different games, you're carrying Miranda and Jack over, and you have to limit things a little bit. Some characters did get more screen time and sort of found to have a more prominent role. Like Garrus and Tali in Mass Effect 1, they seemed to have a bit of a smaller role, but then you go into Mass Effect 2, and it feels like they've had so much more emphasis put on them. They've got like a romance option and everything.
We ended up holding a tiebreaker in her quarters. I had reach, but she had flexibility.
Yep.
Was that like a reaction to like a fan response or reception from their characters in Mass Effect 1?
Yeah, I'd say for sure some of that is in response to fan reaction. Like when people honestly, when I wrote Garrus in Mass Effect 1, it never, for whatever reason, never even crossed my mind to think of him as a romance option. It was like the buddy cop scenario, right? Even if it's femshep, it's still the buddy cop scenario, right? We joked about that all the time. And then you release the game, and there's this, not a majority, but still a vocal outcry of like, when do we get to romance Garrus, right? And the same for Tally, right? And so as much as we can make that possible, I think that was something that we wanted to be able to achieve. On Garrus, maybe I'm a little guilty. I was the lead writer on 2, and he was my character, so maybe that's why he felt like he got a little bit more screen time at 2. That wasn't intentional. We were trying to be fair and equitable with everyone. But I think some of that also, is also, if I'm being honest, because I've heard this before, which is some of it is also the carry forward, right? And one of the things we had to really consider in 2 was we had created, 6 characters that were pretty compelling outside of Shepard, 6 main characters that were pretty compelling in 1. And now we were asking ourselves to create 12, right? And we're like, and make them all meaningful and make them all, as great as the other ones. And that's why we eventually said, no, we should include some of the original cast in here, because that's the task is going to be too high, too hard to achieve. But then we did get a sense that for certainly people who played the originals, it wasn't necessarily even always that, Tally or Garrus had, more screen time per se, but you had more of a connection already, right? It's kind of like when you go to the bar and 3 of your friends are there and 3 new people are there, you might spend the same time together, but you're going to feel differently about, spending the time with the people already, right?
It did feel like you formed a deeper connection with them, though.
Yes,
in
exactly, 100%. And part of that's also us as writers, because we have all that to play on, right? We can play on choices. We can tap into that massive, data set of, what did the player do before, and look at trying to use some of those, which then all of a sudden makes it feel even more personal than it and personalized than perhaps the new characters you're meeting.
In Grunt's recruitment mission in Mass Effect 2, was it ever an option to make it so you could pick Okir over Grunt? Just because personally, in like the 30 seconds you talk with him, I feel like Okir's a really interesting character, and I wouldn't mind spending 40 hours with him.
Yeah, that sounds really familiar, and I can't say for certain that was a conversation, but I do think part of the intention was to really sort of sell you on Okir, and then do the more bait and switch, right? And say, oh, this is what you got, and it's even better. But that's sometimes the risk you run of making a really sort of interesting character who isn't the one you're going to side with, is then people are always going to be like, why not that one? I really like them, because again, not everybody resonates with every character, and they resonate with other ones, sort of thing. So again, I don't remember if we actually debated it or discussed it, but it certainly felt like it was part of some discussion or some conversations that we had back in the day.
Just talking a little bit about, I guess, how developed, if we're kind of link it in, like how developed the characters are in Mass Effect 2. I think the loyalty missions are a big part of that. What was the process of writing those loyalty missions like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, and I was going back through some of my notes for a different interview. I think during some of the anniversaries we had during Legendary Edition on some of our development, especially specifically on Mass Effect 2, and I think I don't know where the actual inception for loyalty missions really came from, but I do remember us having a lot of conversations about how people really enjoyed some of the smaller little tiny missions that you could do for people like Rex or Garrus or whatever on Mass Effect 1. They like that you could go get the armor, or help Rex with this little thing, or help Garrus with this problem he's having, or this decision he wants to make. And so we kind of wanted to lean into that. Interesting thing was the loyalty missions were meant to be, they are generally smaller or shorter than the acquisition missions or the other ones, but they were meant to be like little short things that we did. Of course, in true Bioware fashion, they got much bigger and much more involved in that. But I think the other thing that we ended up doubling down on at one point was we said, look, this game, Mass Effect 2 specifically, is about the characters. Like there's always characters in our game, but this was about the team. It was about the characters. And we realized that in order for you to really connect again with, at the time, 12 and then 10 characters, and have at least have some sort of sense that you feel anything for any of them, we realized we really wanted to devote some time to them. The other thing that I remember, this was a big thing that I was pitching for, was I really wanted a mission where I could be guaranteed that one of the squad mates would be with me, because whenever we write dialogue, banter dialogue, especially. We write it, here are the 6 options, or in Mass Effect 2, okay, here are the 12 options that you can have, and here are the 12 responses to each of those options that you could have. And because of that, you can guess it tends to be fairly generic, right? Like, it's like, oh, sometimes it's like if Miranda and Jack are in the party together, their response to each other will be a little bit more snippy or something like that. But it's not really specific, and you're not learning a ton about any individual character. So there was a real push to have these missions where we could guarantee that someone was with you, and then that banter could be much more focused on that person, right? And the interesting thing is it's very much like what you see in a Last of Us style game, where the two characters are mostly present together, and they can the relationship builds over the course of the game. And that's what people really love, because you can have these moments in between cutscene and in between gameplay where you're still developing relationship between the two characters. And so I think that was also a big impetus for us in developing them. And then the other thing that I'll say on it was, we knew that Mass Effect 2 is going to be the darker middle act, right? And so a lot of the critical path and even some of the acquisition missions, they tended to be just a bit darker or a little bit more serious. Let's just say it's serious for now. And we wanted an opportunity where we have, meaningful missions, but could kind of, just have their own flavor, just to give you a bit of a breath, give you a bit of a different take on it. And then we would wrap those around, of course, the personality of whoever it was you were working with. And so that was one of the other key things that was a consideration, I think, when we were doing the loyalty missions, was just to give you that opportunity to do something that didn't feel like it was necessarily saving the universe, although I think we did a good job of tying it in and making loyalty feel important to the overall mission. But also just that opportunity where it's like, yeah, I'm just going to go hang out with this person because I want to hang out with this person.
Is that sort of like the same thing where, like, in Garrus's loyalty mission, you can just go full renegade and let them take the shot right off the bat, or you can let Land Harsodonis say his piece about why he did what he did? Like that sort of thing?
So, yeah, it is. But sorry, I'm just trying to get to what was the core of the question there? Like,
Well, I'm just saying, like, if you're trying to build, like, the personal relationships, and then, like, I know Garrus specifically, depending on how you are when you talk to him, he can be very Paragon-y or very renegade-y.
Yep.
So it more so like in his loyalty mission, where you can just let him shoot the guy, or you can let the guy talk, and then let Garrus make up his own mind afterwards.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that was also consideration from the original game, which was, Garrus was this character who, was kind of tough and rugged on the outside, but was clearly internally conflicted with a lot of things, right? Like, was struggling with, how, wanted to be sort of like hardline, but wasn't really convicted and convinced himself. And so even in 1, you're already, as Shepard, kind of giving him advice on how he should, deal with his dad or whatever it was. I can't remember specifically, but, and how he should, behave in that sort of moral spectrum. And so I think that was part of, just, if we're going to do something with Garrus, let's see that through, but let's see it in action, not just words now. And I think that's where, to me, a lot of the expression in his loyalty mission was, it's like, how far can we actually push Garrus towards this? Because that's kind of the relationship, which is Garrus obviously idolizes Shepard, looks up to them, and, will start to lean whatever way Shepard thinks they should lean.
Okay.
So it's part of their story, part of their journey.
It was kind of confirmed about the dark energy plot originally being an idea, wasn't it?
Yep.
And so what was it that kind of caused you to diverge from that and choose, the story or the journey, I guess, that we ended up with?
Yeah. So interesting fact, and I don't know if this is actually has been put out there yet, or if it has, I don't know if I remember seeing it. But one of the things we did with Mass Effect was, that we knew that there was the cycle, the Reaper cycle. We knew that they had a purpose and a reason for coming back. But for quite a while, and it didn't persist throughout the entire 3 series, but certainly through the first and part of the second game, we actually maintained sort of competing theories of what that was. And dark energy was one of them. But we didn't want to commit to anyone yet, because we thought there's a couple of reasons. One, it's more mysterious if you don't know, right? Like, we just answer, game one, it's like, yep, this is why the Reapers are. This is why everything happens, and this is exactly it. And it's like, oh, okay, might be good, but what if you don't like it? It might turn you off, right? So I actually purposely maintain multiple sort of threads, and we would gut check against those. So if we were changing the main sort of story or plot, we'd say, does it still work with the multiple sort of theories that we have? And a big one, was the whole idea of sort of singularity and, AI sort of kind of reaching a certain point where, it was going to surpass us and overtake us and then, do what it does to us. But ultimately, as far as why we specifically moved away from it, I actually don't know. Again, I feel like it was one of those evolutions where, um, we planted some seeds. We didn't necessarily feel like they were leading in the specific right direction that we wanted to. And then when it came time to actually write Mass Effect 3 and we needed, it's like, okay, now's the time. Now we've got to answer it. I just remember, I definitely remember us having so many meetings around the reasons and the motivations and, what was actually happening in the universe. And I suspect it was just a matter of, it was the one that most of us sort of aligned around, and that's where we went.
I suppose if you were to track it back, would it have started with Legion? Do you think, like that whole thing about giving the Geth a new, I don't know if fresh coat of paint, but like developing them in a whole different way, and then that kind of led you in that direction? Do you think?
I think so. And there was actually, keep in mind, there was often things influencing us culturally at the time as well, the things that we would gravitate towards. I think the whole topic of AI, it's crazy how much it's front and center of everything we're talking about today. But I think even back then, like call it, 2010-ish, there was already that sort of burbling up of some of this is starting to become a reality, and what does this actually mean for us, not just the people in the game, but what does it mean for us? And I think that started to influence us and start to shape some of our storytelling as we were going through there, for sure.
Yeah.
Did you ever mean, I don't know, that might be the wrong word, but I'm just saying, were the Geth ever written to be sympathetic, or was it supposed to be more like morally ambiguous?
That's a good question. So like, it's interesting because again, that's another evolution. So in the first game, they were just, we said, we need our stormtroopers. We need something that we can mow down mercilessly and you don't have to think about it. We didn't want moral ambiguity at all in that. It's just like, nope, you kill these things, period, full stop. Right. Because, and the reason that was intentional was because we didn't want to burden the player with having to figure out the political system or who's good, who's bad. Is it kind of gray? And then, but once that's established, then now we're like, oh, okay, well now we can introduce new enemies to take that place. Now what do we do with the Geth, right? And then specifically on, did we ever write them to be sympathetic? Well, I would definitely say that Legion was written to provide a perspective that would allow you to empathize with the Geth, 100% for sure. And then from that point on, we certainly wanted to keep them, I think, probably in the realm more like, the Rachni, which was, is this something that's good or evil, misunderstood, not quite sure, because again, certainly for me, and I've answered this question a lot, when you talk about, your antagonists in any way in storytelling, I'm much more a fan of those who are gray, the Aryas, the Elusive Man of the world, because it's just more interesting, right? It's more interesting if you're not sure if they're fully evil or fully good. There are times where it's nice just to have a clear cut. You're the good guy, you're the bad guy. But a lot of times, especially in a story that is as expansive as ours, having that ambiguity is much more fun to play with, and I think I would hope much more enjoyable to experience as well.
No, I mean, like, I 100% agree. I'm just saying, it's like, to me, in my personal opinion, I don't understand how anyone can play the Geth server mission on Rannoch and come away thinking the Quarians are anything other than genocidal war criminals.
Yeah, but I think that's the other interesting thing about it is that we see this in great storytelling where it's like you sympathize with a certain group or person, and then you realize it's like, oh wow, you do terrible things sometimes, right?
Yeah,
And it changes
exactly.
your perspective of it. I mean, um, Game of Thrones is rife with that. You start off hating everybody, and by the middle of the book, it's the flip. You're just like, oh, I love all the people I hated, and I'm apathetic towards all the people I liked. And
I love Jade Empire. Was there ever talk or discussion about a sequel? Because I know the game's kind of cliche and it's very predictable, but it still has a cult following.
yeah. Up until literally the day I left, we were talking about it. In some vein, especially I would say after the success of the Legendary Edition. I've been trying to convince people to not just do a remaster, but actually a re-envisioning, like a proper reboot of the series, for a while, as had other people at the studio. I agree. I think there's a lot about the original which should just stay in the past. Let's leave it leave it there. But at the
Yeah,
same time, there's
it
a lot
shows
of
its
things.
age.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that about it. It was still a well thought out IP. It was still a rich world with so much more to explore and so much more to do. And because of the nature of it, like there's so much we could have brought that forward to modern times. That was one of the pitches I remember I gave at one point. It's like, imagine if all that magic carried forward and it was modern times. So now we've got ancient Chinese magic in a kind of Harry Potter-esque nature in our time, sort of thing. Like, that sounds like a lot of fun. Why don't we do that, right? I'm not there anymore, but I sort of hope that one day somebody goes, yeah, we're going to do it, and they do it.
How big of a fan of Dungeons and Dragons are you? And just the team in general, I guess, while you were working there. And do you know if there was much inspiration there from D&D in Dragon Age and how that was created and developed?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak specifically to how much, but I think obviously it varies. I would say I was a middling fan of D&D myself. I was always a fan of it, but had never really participated on a lengthy scale. But I knew people who had been in campaigns for years, maybe even decades, that were at the company. Definitely huge fans there. And I will tell you this story. It wasn't D&D, but it was a D&D like game. This is sad. I was an only child, so keep this in mind. We went on a trip with school to Toronto, which is a big center, and we went to this sort of, it was like a Games Workshop type store, and I found this. It was like a post-apocalyptic D&D-esque style game. I was like, this sounds incredible. Bought it, brought it back home with me. It was like one of the few things I bought on the trip, and I could literally find no one to play with me. And so I proceeded to create multiple characters, DM'd it. The cats were involved. I even had my mom involved. She didn't know she was involved, but she was in there, and I would just play everything. It didn't last too long, but I mean, I was always enthralled with the role-playing experience and all the trappings around it. And so when I could discover games like The Bard's Tale or anything like that sort of did all the work for me behind the scenes, but let me just now go experience that and play it. I was a huge fan of that, but then I never really got back into proper tabletop or into the IP of that. Although I have passed it on to my kids. They like to play and create characters all the time and get minis and stuff like that. So,
have you seen that there's actually a Mass Effect fan D&D style podcast out there?
No, I don't think I have.
They're called Mass Effect Adventum, and Mark
Okay.
Meer actually appears from time to time.
Oh, does he?
As a
That doesn't surprise
vulture,
me.
yeah.
Good for him. Good for him. Does he wear the mask?
Oh no, I don't think he appears on camera for it, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. So I remember he had a mask at one point. Sorry, I missed the question. What's the question?
Oh, I just said, what's your favorite class and why is it Vanguard?
Yeah, it's funny. Vanguard became everyone's favorite in 2 because all of a sudden you could just close the gap on people and have so much fun with that. But no, I was actually Infiltrator. I like to sneak. I like to snipe. That's my my go-to.
Is that why? So were you the reason why on Tuchanka specifically if you play as an infiltrator, when you turn invisible, the Krogan yell at you and say, like, or if you use an SMG, they say use a real man's weapon.
I'd like to say that was for me. I bet you that was John Dunbar though, because I think that was his. I think that was his mission.
So being a writer,
Mhm.
you've I think you penned a book between the end of Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda.
Yep.
What obviously that's going to be completely different to writing a video game.
Yeah.
So is there like is it harder, or is it what's the key differences between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is similar to, the graphic novels. 'Cause I did, dozens of those as well. It is easier. There's just no way to put it. It's definitely easier to write, when you don't have to really factor in, that sort of player agency, right? Player agency is a really hard thing to do well in a story, right? And letting people tell their own or feel like they're telling their own story is super challenging, right? Because you want to author it, you want to have these emotional moments and peak at the right time, but when you don't know what the player is going to do, you don't know what they were just doing before the conversation, very challenging. Versus writing, and I want to make it sound it was easy. All writing is hard. It has its challenges, but as a comparative, much easier when you can just focus on the singular narrative. The one thing that I would say is harder though, more so with the novel than the graphic novels, is I really missed the collaborative nature of writing for games, because so much of any kind of creative endeavor is you work at it for a bit and you kind of get frustrated, or you're like, I don't know if this is the right thing, and then you got to kind of put it down and walk away from it. But when you're working in video games, it's fantastic because you can go talk to other people, share your idea, they come back at you with something that's just even better than what you were thinking, and you incorporate that in. Versus and there's a bit of that with the graphic novel as well, because you'd be working with artists and editors and things like that, so a little bit more of that. But in the novel, it was just kind of like, yeah, you're just, typical what you'd imagine writers do, just alone in a room, hoping your ideas are good. And then one day your editor comes back at you and, gives you your feedback and stuff like that. So that was the one thing that I found more challenging and less enjoyable about the process. But otherwise, it was certainly easier.
Ever find it interesting, like when you're writing a novel versus a video game, do you find it more challenging or interesting, I guess, as a better word, to figure out, like, when you're writing for multiple things at the same time versus as if it's in a book, it's going to be this?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot more challenging to do, because it's not just about, you have to come up with, multiple options that are interesting. You have to come up with multiple options that are interesting that also don't break the character or break the immersion that you already have, or the expectation you have for both the player character, but any, characters you're interacting with. Right. So, it's always about that fine line of, oh, did I push Garrus too far in that, or did I push Shepard too far in that? And often we did, and we'd have to pull back in and rewrite and do that. So it's definitely again, it is one of the hardest things to do and do well, I think, when you in the vein and in the way that we did it, right, where we really gave you as much choice as you did. I was always amazed how often I heard fans refer to Shepard as my Shepard. I don't remember hearing that. It's like my Shepard. They take ownership of that, and a lot of it is because I believe of the choices that we allowed them to take, and the fact that we were able to keep that character feeling consistent for that player, regardless of what choices they took. Right? Which it might not seem like a challenge, but in hindsight, like when I look back on it, it's like I don't know that I would ever make a game like that knowingly, if I would make a game like that again.
You mentioned speaking like working collaboratively, you miss that kind of interaction. With the rise of things like AI and GPT and stuff.
Yeah.
Do you think that you'll incorporate that more in your writing, or is it something that actually might make you as a writer obsolete in the future?
Oh, yeah, I love these questions. I'm a huge fan, just as a side note, I'm a huge, amateur futurist. I get a lot of my inspiration actually from the real world and what's happening throughout. I'm often inspired by nonfiction and what's happening in reality, and certainly what's happening with AI right now is mind blowing, even as someone who's followed it and hoped for some of these things to happen, right? As far as it replacing me, I don't know. I don't think I'm too concerned about it necessarily replacing me. A lot of what I've seen is that the people it will potentially replace first are those who are just refuse to adopt it anyway, straight, at all. Like if they just ignore it and don't even think it as a viable tool or a resource or something like that, those people may well get replaced, in certain realms, just because it does provide a huge advantage, I believe, for the creative process. Any tool does, right? Anything that helps you springboard or leapfrog, whether it's talking to your team or talking to ChatGPT and bouncing ideas or whatever off, it's moving the creative process forward. Creative process, a lot of people think of it as like, oh, I have a great idea. It's like the great idea is just the start, and then you need to have 1,000 more ideas that follow that, right? And if it's you doing it on your own, that can be a slog, a really slow process. So any tool that I think that can sort of move you forward. Another great one, and I'll be very careful when I talk about this one, is Midjourney. And I know that there's some concerns about how Midjourney has gone about, getting to the point where it has, and I'm full agreement. I don't think it was the most ethical or best way of actually handling it. But as somebody who can't draw but has lots of visions in their head of the worlds that they want to create and the things that they want to do, it's been this incredible tool where I'm not using it to promote anything or do anything, but it's like I have an image of something, and then I can see it, and then that inspires me to think about it in a different way, and then I write about it more, right? So it's fascinating, and I do think it's going to change how we make video games. It might not change, ultimately, um, how good those games are. I think one of the biggest benefits we'll probably see is seeing smaller teams that maybe were traditionally more indie being able to do things that feel a little bit more AAA, right? I think that's exciting because some of my favorite games of the last few years have been indie games.
And do you see like the games, like storytelling games? Do you see that getting to a point where we can possibly like choose our ending to films and that sort of thing, or is it going forward? Do you think it's just going to solely stick with games themselves rather than kind of seep out into other media and that?
No, I could definitely. It's a really good point. I could definitely see something like that in film. Like the debate will be whether this is good or not. But I'll give you my futurist sort of version of this. I can totally see a world 5 to 10 years from now where you literally come home and instead of selecting from a list of, movies or shows on Netflix or whatever your thing of choice is, you just are like, entertain me, hit the entertain me button, and you watch something that is literally made for you as you sit there and watch it, live action. I know that seems crazy, but I've seen enough of the different pieces of that technology already in play today that I could see that happening. Now, again, is it good? Was it just like maybe a level above doom scrolling at night, right, on your phone? Maybe. But could we get there? Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any advice for any other aspiring writers? Or
Advice for aspiring writers. I mean, it's the same that I think I would give for anyone who wants to get into games or into, especially nowadays with the tools that are available, which is don't wait for an opportunity to write or create. You have what you need there. Just start doing it, because the hardest process, I have found personally as a writer, is finishing. Right? It's, we can all generally start something, blank page syndrome is a thing, but a lot of times but it's not until you actually finish it. And even if the only thing you do is finish it for yourself, that's a huge step. If let's say your goal is to write a novella, and you write that novella, you finish it. And when I say finish it, I mean, it's like, it's gone through a couple rounds in your head of iteration, stuff like that, but you're done, like as good as you think you're going to get it. You're already, 90% farther than most people will ever get in writing, because a lot of people just don't take it to the end. And, you get I'll iterate on this chapter for, whatever, but I never get past that. Right. It's not fun. It's not exciting. It's not maybe not the best advice, from I was hoping, there's something easier, but
That's so true, though.
yeah, I'm very excited about the future, whether it's, the things we've been talking about, especially as it pertains to interactive narrative and storytelling. I really think, seeing what, Naughty Dog's done with The Last of Us and its, transition to TV, and seeing the merging of technologies, and the adoption of our tools and tech into film and TV. I'm just really excited about the future of interactive storytelling, because I feel like we are just scratching the surface of where we can get to with it. Like, I think some of the stories that we're going to see in game specifically are going to be some of the, in the next 5-10 years are going to be the best stories period out there. And I think for a long time, games have tried to emulate other mediums and tried to get there, and maybe stumbled a bit because they're still games and we have to make them gamey. But I think we're kind of getting past that now, and I'm really excited to see what that next generation looks like, where we actually create interactive stories that are the premier way to experience those narratives.
If anybody wants
thank
to
you.
follow you, how do they?
Oh, good point. Yeah, I guess on Twitter at MacWaltersLives is probably the best way at this point. I'd say LinkedIn, but that's pretty boring. Let's not go into that.
Yeah, no, thank you ever so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank
Thank
you so
you,
much.
sir.
Have a great
Thank
weekend.
you.
I want to say a massive thank you to Matt Walters for taking his time out to join us today. Absolutely fantastic, and a really joy to speak to him. I could have spoken to him for hours. I had so many questions. And he did overrun as well, so I appreciate him staying on longer than was agreed. You can find his Twitter handle down in the description. I was also fortunate to speak to Mark Darrah from the Dragon Age series, and you can watch that video right there on screen now. Don't forget to hit that like button or the join button for memberships. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Commander. You can find his Twitter handle.